Hello. Okay, I'm finishing up chapter 5. Let's see, what was that? Page 90. Okay. So, the Great Awakening. In all the colonial churches, religion was less fervid in the early 18th century than it had been a century earlier, when the colonies were first planted. The Puritan churches, in particular, sagged under the weight of two burdens: their elaborate theological doctrines and their compromising efforts to liberalize membership requirements. Churchgoers increasingly complained about the dead dogs who droned out tedious, overly erudite sermons from the Puritan pulpits. Some ministers, on the other hand, worried that many of their parishioners had gone soft and that their souls were no longer kindled by the hellfire of orthodox Calvinism. Liberal ideas began to challenge the old-time religion. Some worshippers now proclaimed that human beings were not necessarily predestined to damnation and might not save themselves by leading a life of good works. Most threatening to the Calvinist doctrine of predestination was Arminianism, named after the Dutch theologian Jacobus Arminius, who preached that individual free will, not divine decree, determined a person's eternal fate, and that all humans, not just the elect, could be saved if they freely accepted God's grace. Pressured by these heresies, a few churches grudgingly conceded that spiritual conversion was not necessary for church membership. Together, these twin trends towards clerical intellectualism. Oh my gosh. These twin trends towards clerical intellectualism and lay liberalism were sapping doctrinal rigor from many denominations, though Americans remained a remarkably religious people. The stage was thus set for a rousing religious revival. Known as the Great Awakening, it exploded in the 1730s and 40s and swept through the colonies like a fire through prairie grass. The awakening was first ignited in Northampton, Massachusetts, by a tall, delicate, and intellectual pastor, Jonathan Edwards. Perhaps the deepest theological mind ever nurtured in America, Edwards proclaimed with burning righteousness the folly of believing in salvation through good works and affirmed the need for complete dependence on God's grace. Warming to his subject, he pained in lurid detail the landscape of hell and the eternal torments of the damned. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God was the title of one of his most famous sermons. He believed that hell was paved with the skulls of unbaptized children. Edwards's preaching style was learned and closely reasoned, but his stark doctrine sparked a warmly sympathetic reaction among his parishioners in 1734. 4 years later than the itinerant English parson George Whitefield loosed a different style of evangelical preaching on America and touched off a conflagration of religious ardor that revolutionized the spiritual life of the colonies. A former alehouse attendant, Whitefield was an orator of rare gifts. His magnificent voice boomed sonorously over thousands of enthralled listeners in an open field. One of England's greatest actors of the day commented enviously that Whitefield could make an audiences weep merely by pronouncing the word Mesopotamia, and that he would give 100 guineas if he could only say, "Oh," like Mr. Whitefield. Triumphantly touring the colonies, Whitefield trumpeted his message of human helplessness and divine omnipotence. His eloquence reduced Jonathan Edwards to tears and even caused the skeptical and thrifty Benjamin Franklin to empty his pockets into the collection plate. During these roaring revival meetings, countless sinners professed conversion, and hundreds of the saved groaned, shrieked, or rolled in the snow from religious excitation. Whitefield soon inspired American imitators. Taking up his electrifying new style of preaching, they heaped abuse on sinners and shook enormous audiences with emotional appeals. One preacher cackled hideously in the face of hapless wrongdoers. Another, naked to the waist, leapt frantically about in the light of flickering torches. Orthodox clergymen, known as Old Lights, were deeply skeptical of the emotionalism and the theatrical antics of the revivalists. New Lights, on the other hand, defended the awakening for its role in revitalizing American religion. Congregationalists and Presbyterians split over this issue, and many of the believers in religious conversion went over to the Baptists, Methodists, and other sects more prepared to take room for emotion and religion. The awakening left many lasting effects. Its emphasis on direct, emotive, spirituality seriously undermined the older clergy, whose authority had derived from their education and erudition. The schisms it set off in many denominations greatly increased the number of the competitiveness of American churches. It encouraged a fresh new wave of missionary work among the Indians and even among black slaves, many of whom also attended the mass open-air revivals. It led to the founding of new light centers of higher learning, such as Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth. Perhaps the most significant, the Great Awakening was the first spontaneous mass movement of the American people. It tended to break down sectional boundaries as well as denominational lines and contributed to the growing sense that Americans were a single people, united by a common history and shared experiences. Goodness. Schools and colleges. A time-honored English idea regarded education as a blessing reserved for the aristocratic few, not for the unwashed many. Education should be for leadership, not citizenship, and primarily for males. Only slowly and painfully did the colonists break the chains of these ancient restrictions. Puritan New England, largely for religious reasons, was more zealously interested in education than any other section. Dominated by the Congregational Church, it stressed the need for Bible reading by the individual worshiper. The primary goal of the clergy was to make good Christians rather than good citizens. A more secular approach was evident late in the 18th century, when some children were warned in the following verse: "He who never learns his ABC forever will a blockhead be, but he who learns his letters fair shall have a coach to take the air." Education, principally for the boys, flourished almost from the outset in New England. This densely populated region boasted an impressive number of graduates from the English universities, especially Cambridge, the intellectual center of England's Puritanism. New Englanders at a relatively early date established their primary and secondary schools, which varied widely in the quality of instruction and in the length of time that their doors remained open each year. Backstraining farm labor drained much of a youth's time and energy. Fairly adequate elementary schools were also hammering knowledge into the heads of reluctant scholars in the middle colonies and in the South. Some of these institutions were tax-supported, others were privately operated. The South, with its white and black population diffused over wide areas, was severely handicapped by geography in attempting to establish an effective school system. Wealthy families leaned heavily on private tutors. The general atmosphere in the colonial schools and colleges continued grim and gloomy. Most of the emphasis was placed on religion and on classical languages, like Latin and Greek. The focus was not on experiment and reason, but on doctrine and dogma. The age was one of orthodoxy, and independence of thinking was discouraged. Discipline was quite severe, and with many a mischievous child being sadistically birched with a switch cut from a birch tree. Sometimes punishment was inflicted by indentured servant teachers, who could themselves be whipped for their failures as workers, and who therefore were not inclined to spare the rod. College education, at least at first in New England, was geared towards preparing men for the ministry. After all, churches would wither if a new crop of ministers was not adequately trained to lead the region's spiritual flocks. Annoyed by this exclusively religious emphasis, many well-to-do families, especially in the South, sent their boys abroad to acquire a real, meaning a refined and philosophical, education in elite English institutions. For purposes of convenience and economy, 9 local colleges were established during the colonial era. Student enrollments were small, numbering about 200 boys at the most, and at one time a few lads as young as 11 were admitted to Harvard. Instruction was poor by present-day standards. The curriculum was still heavily loaded with theology and the dead languages, although by 1750 there was a distinct trend toward live languages and other modern subjects. A significant contribution was made by Benjamin Franklin. He had never attended college, but played a major role in launching what became the University of Pennsylvania, the first American college free from denominational control. A provincial culture. When it came to art and colonial Americans were still in the thrall to European tastes, especially British. The simplicity of pioneering life had not yet bred the many homespun patrons of the arts. One aspiring painter, John Trumbull, of Connecticut, was discouraged in his youth by his father's chilling remark, "Connecticut is not Athens." Like so many of his talented artistic contemporaries, Trumbull was forced to travel to London to pursue his ambitions. Charles Willson Peale, best known for his portraits of George Washington, ran a museum, stuffed birds, and practiced dentistry. Gifted Benjamin West and precocious John Singleton Copley succeeded in their ambitions to become famous painters, but like Trumbull, they had to go to England to complete their training. Only abroad could they find subjects who had the leisure to sit for their portraits and the money to pay handsomely for them. Copley was regarded as a loyalist during the Revolutionary War, and West, a close friend of George III and official court painter, was buried in London's St. Paul's Cathedral. Architecture was largely imported from the Old World and modified to meet the peculiar climatic and religious conditions of the New World. Even the lowly log cabin was apparently borrowed from Sweden. The red-bricked Georgian style, so common in the pre-revolutionary decades, was introduced around 1720 and is best exemplified by the beauty of now-restored Williamsburg, Virginia. Colonial literature, like art, was generally undistinguished, and for many of the same reasons. One noteworthy exception was the precocious poet Phillis Wheatley. an enslaved girl brought to Boston at age 8 and never formally educated. Taken to England when 20 years of age, she published a book of verse and subsequently wrote other polished poems that revealed the influence of Alexander Pope. Her verse compares favorably with the best of the poetry colonial period, but the remarkable fact is that she could overcome her severely disadvantaged background and write any poetry at all. Versatile Benjamin Franklin, often called the first civilized American, also shone as a literary light. Although his autobiography is now a classic, he was also best known to his contemporaries for Poor Richard's Almanac, which he edited from 1732 to 1758. This famous publication, containing many pithy sayings culled from the thinkers of the ages, emphasized such homespun virtues as thrift, industry, morality, and common sense. Examples are, "What maintains one vice would bring up 2 children. Plow deep while sluggards sleep. Honesty is the best policy," and "Fish and visitors stink in 3 days." Poor Richard's was well known in Europe and was more widely read in America than anything except the Bible. Dispensing witty advice to old and young alike, Franklin had an incalculable influence in shaping the American character. Science, rising above the shackles of superstition, was making some progress, though lagging behind that of the Old World. A few botanists, mathematicians, and astronomers had won some repute, but Benjamin Franklin was perhaps the only first-rank scientist produced in the American colonies. Franklin's spectacular but dangerous experiments, including the famous kite-flying episode proving that lightning was a form of electricity, won him numerous honors in Europe. But his mind also had a practical turn. Among his numerous inventions were bifocal spectacles and the highly efficient Franklin stove. His lightning rod, perhaps not surprisingly, was condemned by some stodgy clergymen who felt it was presuming on God by attempting to control the artillery of the heavens. Okay. Pioneer presses. Stump-grubbing Americans were generally too poor to buy quantities of books and too busy to read them. A South Carolina merchant in 1744 advertised the arrival of a shipment of printed books, pictures, maps, and pickles. A few private libraries of fair size could be found, especially among the clergy. The Byrd family of Virginia enjoyed perhaps the largest collection in the colonies, consisting of about 4,000 volumes. Bustling Benjamin Franklin established in Philadelphia the first privately supported circulating library in America, and by 1776 there were about 50 public libraries and collections supported by subscription. Hand-operated printing presses canked out pamphlets, leaflets, and journals. On the eve of the Revolution, there were about 40 colonial newspapers, chiefly weeklies that consisted of a single large sheet folded once. Columns ran heavily to somber essays, frequently signed with such pseudonyms as Cicero, Philosophicus, and Pro Bono Publico, for the public good. The news often lagged many weeks behind the event, especially in the case of overseas happenings, in which the colonists were deeply interested. Newspapers proved to be a powerful agency for airing colonial grievances and rallying opposition for British control. A celebrated legal case, in 1734-35, involved John Peter Zenger, a newspaper printer. Significantly, the Zenger trial arose in New York, reflecting the tumultuous give-and-take of politics in the Middle Colonies, where so many different ethnic groups jostled against one another. Zenger's newspaper had assailed the corrupt royal governor. Charged with seditious libel, the accused was hauled into court, where he was defended by a former indentured servant, now a distinguished Philadelphia lawyer, Andrew Hamilton. Zenger argued that he had printed the truth, but the bewigged royal chief justice instructed the jury not to consider the truth or falsity of Zenger's statements. The mere fact of printing, irrespective of the truth, was enough to convict. Hamilton countered that the very liberty of both exposing and opposing arbitrary power was at stake. Swayed by his eloquence, the jurors defied the bewigged judges and daringly returned a verdict of not guilty. Cheers burst from the spectators. The Zenger decision was a banner achievement for freedom of the press and for the health of democracy. It pointed the way to the kind of open public discussion required by the diverse society that colonial New York already was, and that all America was to become. Although contrary to existing law and not immediately accepted by other judges and juries, in time it helped establish the doctrine that true statements about public officials could not be prosecuted as libel. Newspapers were thus eventually free to print responsible criticisms of powerful officials, though full freedom of the press was unknown during the pre-revolutionary era. The great game of politics. American colonists may have been backward in natural or physical science, but they were making noteworthy contributions to political science. The 13 colonial governments took a variety of forms. By 1775, 8 of the colonies had royal governors who were appointed by the king. 3, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, were under proprietors who themselves chose the governors, and 2, Connecticut and Rhode Island, elected their own governors under self-governing charters. Practically every colony utilized a two-house legislative body. The upper house, or council, was normally appointed by the crown in the royal colonies and by the proprietor in the proprietary colonies. It was chosen by voters in the self-governing colonies. The lower house, as the popular branch, was elected by the people, or rather by those who owned enough property to qualify as voters. In several of the colonies, the backcountry elements were seriously underrepresented, and they hated the ruling colonial clique perhaps more than they did kingly authority. Legislators, in which the people enjoyed direct representation, voted such taxes as they chose for the necessary expenses of colonial government. Self-taxation through representation was a precious privilege that Americans had come to cherish above most others. Governors appointed by the king were generally able men, sometimes outstanding figures. Some, unfortunately, were incompetent or corrupt, broken-down politicians badly in need of jobs. The worst of the group was probably impoverished Lord Cornbury, first cousin of Queen Anne, who was made governor of New York and New Jersey in 1702. He proved to be a drunkard, a spendthrift, a grafter, an embezzler, a religious bigot, and a vain fool, who was accused, probably inaccurately, of dressing like a woman. Even the best appointees had trouble with the colonial legislators, basically because the royal governor embodied a bothersome transatlantic authority some 3,000 miles away. The colonial assemblies found various ways to assert their authority and independence. Some of them employed the trick of withholding the governor's salary unless he yielded to their wishes. He was normally in need of money. Otherwise, he would not have come to this god-forsaken country, so the power of the purse usually forced him to terms. But one governor of North Carolina died with his salary 11 years in arrears. 11 years in arrears. The London government, in leaving the colonial governor to the tender mercies of the legislator, was guilty of poor administration. In the interest of simple efficiency, the British authorities should have arranged to pay him from independent sources. As events turned out, control over the purse by the colonial legislators led to prolonged bickering, which proved to be one of the persistent irritants that generated a spirit of revolt. Administration at the local level was also varied. County government remained the rule in Plantation South, town meeting government predominated in New England, and a modification of the two developed in the middle colonies. In the town meeting, with its open discussion and open voting, direct democracy functioned at its best. In this unrivaled cradle of self-government, Americans learned to cherish their privileges and exercise their duties as citizens of the New World commonwealths. Yet the ballot was by no means a birthright. Religious or property qualifications for voting, with even stiffer qualifications for office holding, existed in all the colonies in 1775. The privileged upper class, fearful of democratic excesses, were unwilling to grant the ballot to every biped of the forest. Perhaps half of the adult white males were thus disfranchised, but because of the ease of acquiring land and thus satisfying property requirements, the right to vote was not beyond the reach of most industrious and enterprising colonists. Yet, somewhat surprisingly, eligible voters often did not exercise this precious privilege. They frequently acquiesced in the leadership of their betters, who ran colonial affairs, though always reserving the right to vote misbehaving rascals out of office. By 1775, America was not yet a true democracy, socially, economically, or politically, but it was far more democratic than England and the European continent. Colonial institutions were giving freer rein to the democratic ideals of tolerance, educational advantages, equality of economic opportunity, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and representative government. And these democratic seeds, planted in rich soil, were to bring forth a lush harvest in later years. Colonial folkways. Everyday life in the colonies may now seem glamorous, especially as reflected in antique shops, but judged by modern standards, it was drab and tedious. For most people, the labor was heavy and constant, from can-see to can't-see. Food was plentiful, though the diet could be coarse and monotonous. Americans probably ate more bountifully, especially of meat, than any people in the Old World. Lazy or sickly was the person whose stomach was empty. Basic comforts, now taken for granted, were lacking. Churches were not heated at all, except for the charcoal foot-warmers that women carried. During the frigid New England winters, the preaching of hellfire may not have seemed altogether unattractive. Drafty homes were poorly heated, chiefly by inefficient fireplaces. There was no running water in the houses, no indoor plumbing, and probably not a single bathtub in all of colonial America. Candles and whale oil lamps provided faint and flickering illumination. Garbage disposal was primitive. Long-snouted hogs customarily ranged the streets to consume refuse, while buzzards, protected by law, flapped greedily over tidbits of waste. Amusement was eagerly pursued here where time and custom permitted. The militia assembled periodically for musters, which consisted of several days of drilling liberally interspersed with merrymaking and flirting. On the frontier, pleasure was often combined with work at house raisings, quilting bees, husking bees, and apple parings. Funerals and weddings everywhere afforded opportunities for social gatherings, which customarily involved the swilling of much strong liquor. Winter sports were common in the north, whereas in the south, card-playing, horse-racing, cockfighting, and fox-hunting were favorite pastimes. George Washington, not surprisingly, was a superb rider. In the non-puritanical South, dancing was the rage. Jigs, square dances, the Virginia reel, and the agile Washington could swing his fair partner with the best of them. Other diversions beckoned. Lotteries were universally approved, even by the clergy, and were used to raise money for churches and colleges, including Harvard. Stage plays became popular in the South, but were frowned upon in Quaker and Puritan colonies, and in some places forbidden by the law. Many of the New England clergy saw play acting as time-consuming and immoral. They preferred religious lectures, from which their flocks derived much spiritual satisfaction. Holidays were everywhere celebrated in the American colonies, but Christmas was frowned upon in New England as an offensive reminder of popery. Yuletide is fooltide, was a common Puritan sneer. Thanksgiving Day came to be a truly American festival, for it combined thanks to God with an opportunity for jollification, gorging, and guzzling. By the mid-18th century, Britain's several North American colonies, despite their differences, revealed some striking similarities. All were basically English in language and customs and Protestant in religion, while the widespread presence of other peoples and faiths compelled every colony to cede at least some degree of ethnic and religious toleration. Compared with contemporary Europe, they all afforded to enterprising individuals unusual opportunities for social mobility. They all possessed some measure of self-government, though by no means complete democracy. Communication and transportation among the colonies were improving. British North America by 1775 looked like a patchwork quilt, each part slightly different, but stitched together by common origins, common ways of life, and common beliefs in toleration, economic development, and, above all, self-rule. Fatefully, all the colonies were also separated from the seat of imperial authority by a vast ocean moat some 3,000 miles wide. These simple facts of shared history, culture, and geography set the stage for the colonists' struggle to unite as an independent people. This is stretching. Okay. Varying viewpoints. Colonial America. Communities of conflict or consensus. The earliest historians of colonial society portrayed close-knit, homogeneous, and hierarchical communities. Richard Bushman's From Puritan to Yankee, 1967, challenged that traditional view when he described colonial New England as an expanding, opening society. In this view, the colonists gradually lost the religious discipline and social structure of the founding generations as they poured out onto the frontier or sailed the seas in search of fortune and adventure. Rhys Isaac viewed the Great Awakening in the South as similar evidence of the erosion of social constraints and deference that once held colonial society together. Unbridled religious enthusiasm, directed by itinerant preachers both North and South, encouraged the sort of quest for personal autonomy that eventually led Americans to demand national independence. Other scholars have focused on the negative aspects of this alleged breakdown in the traditional order, particularly on the rise of new social inequalities. Social historians like Kenneth Lockridge have argued that the decline of cohesive communities, population pressure on the land, and continued dominance of church and parental authority gave rise to a landless class, forced to till tenant plots in the countryside or find work as manual laborers in the cities. Gary Nash, in The Urban Crucible, likewise traced the rise of competitive individualistic social order in colonial cities, marking the end of patronage and paternalism that had once bound communities together. Increasingly, Nash contended, class antagonisms split communities. The wealthy abandoned the traditional obligations toward the poor for more selfish capitalistic social relations that favored their class peers. The consequent politicization of the laboring classes helped motivate their participation in the American Revolution. Some scholars have disputed that declension undermined colonial communities. Kristen Herman, in particular, has argued in Commerce and Culture that the decline of traditional mores has been overstated. Religious beliefs and commercial activities coexisted throughout the late 17th and the early 18th centuries. Similarly, Jack Green has suggested that the obsession with the decline of deference has obscured the fact that the colonies outside of New England, like Virginia and Maryland, actually experienced a consolidation of religious and social authority throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, becoming more hierarchical and paternalistic. Like Green, many historians have focused on sectional differences between the colonies and the peculiar nature of social equality and inequality in each. Much of the impetus for this inquiry seems from an issue that has long perplexed students of early America: the simultaneous evolution of a rigid racial caste system alongside democratic political institutions. Decades ago, when most historians came from Yankee stock, they resolved the apparent paradox by locating the seeds of democracy in New England. The aggressive independence of the people, best expressed by the boisterous town meetings, spawned the American obsession with freedom. On the other hand, this view holds, the slave societies of the South were hierarchical, aristocratic communities under the sway of a few powerful planters. More recently, some historians have attacked this simple dichotomy, noting many undemocratic features in colonial New England and arguing that while the South may have been the site of tremendous inequality, it also produced most of the founding fathers: Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, the architects of American government with its foundation in liberty, all hailed from slaveholding Virginia. In fact, nowhere were Republican principles stronger than in Virginia. Some scholars, notably Edmund S. Morgan in American Slavery, American Freedom, consider the willingness of wealthy planters to concede the equality of freedom in all white males a device to ensure racial solidarity and to mute class conflict. In this view, the concurrent emergence of slavery and democracy was no paradox. White racial solidarity muffled animosity between rich and poor and fostered the devotion to equality among whites that became a hallmark of American democracy. Historians of Latin America point out that other New World societies, like Brazil and Mexico, had far sharper class divisions than the British colonies, with lasting consequences for their social integrity and political stability. Few historians still argue that the colonies offered boundless opportunities for inhabitants, white or black. But scholars disagree vigorously over what kinds of inequalities and social tensions most shaped the 18th century society and contributed to the revolutionary agitation that eventually consumed and transformed colonial America. Even so, whether one accepts Morgan's argument that Americans bought their independence with slave labor, or those interpretations that point to rising social conflict between whites as the salient characteristic of colonial society on the eve of the Revolution, the once common assumption that America was a world of equality and consensus no longer reigns undisputed. Yet because one's life chances were still unquestionably better in America than in Europe, immigrants continued to pour in, imbued with the high expectations about America as a land of opportunity. Whew, that one was a mouthful. Alright. Yay.